This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Yeah? Okay, all good. So, with the notes, these notes basically summarise all of Unit 4 for you. So that's why they're kind of thick. And the PowerPoint is obviously just the PowerPoint, okay? So in the PowerPoint today, just to be efficient, we're not going through every single topic in Unit 4, just because it does get a bit repetitive. So basically, everything is covered in here. So if you have any specific doubts about specific topics in Unit 4 that we don't cover, you can just see me afterwards and I can explain it. Okay? So today what we're going to do is we are going through, so that's just about me. I guess you already all know a bit about me from the middle of the year lecture. Today's plan is basically we just want to go through some of the commonly misunderstood topics. I guess at this point of the year you've already finished Unit 4, so I don't really want to go through every topic of Unit 4 again. But I just want to give you guys kind of exam tips, where do students lose marks, where can you prevent yourself from losing marks, just some exam tips as well for preparing for the exam, how to approach the exam, answer questions, all that kind of stuff. On top of that, the lecture handout, the recording from today, the slides, everything will be available on the KLD portal to access. In case I forget, one of you please remind me that I've also got some slides here that cover all of Unit 4, which I've been just showing to my kids throughout the year. Just give me your email address before you leave so then I can email that to you today as well. Okay, oops, sorry, open that again. Okay, so, and if you've got any questions, just feel free to email me. From now until the time of the exam, if you want me to look over your response, see where you can get some marks for that, etc., etc. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with going through the misunderstood topics in Unit 4. So one of the first topics you cover in Unit 4 is consciousness, looking at all the different states of consciousness. Most students know how to define consciousness, so they know the definition, they know the different types, NWC, ASC. But when it comes to explaining consciousness as a psychological construct, that's where a lot of students are confused as to what they should write. So a typical exam question which VCEE have been giving, not recently, but in the old study design, is that they want you to talk about, explain what is meant by consciousness as a psychological construct. So a psychological construct is this kind of complex terminology. A lot of students don't understand what it is. But just like happiness, sadness, love, all of those abstract concepts, consciousness is also one of your abstract concepts. And so psychological construct refers to something that we know exists, but we cannot directly observe it. And because we cannot directly observe it, we can't 100% for sure measure it accurately either. So like everyone in this classroom, for example, is kind of like looking towards the teacher. They look like they're concentrating, but I can't be 110% sure that everyone is, in the focused attention state of consciousness. And as you can see in the picture, some people are daydreaming, some are actually paying attention. So we don't know for sure. So that's why consciousness is a psychological construct, because it is an example of a concept that we know exists, but we cannot directly observe it. And so you should be able to give an example to support that point as well. Okay, so just remember that it's not just about defining consciousness, but also about linking it to this concept of psychological construct. The next thing that we go through, which is not really a difficult topic, but it's one of those topics that you might be asked to link to the biopsychosocial framework. So a lot of the time when we talk about the biopsychosocial framework, we usually look at it in the lens of mental health. Okay, so how does a person with specific phobia, how do the biological, psychological and social risk factors affect them? So basically, we're not always asked to link the biopsychosocial framework to sleep-wake cycle shifts, but you can be asked to do that in an exam situation. So you might be asked a question like, evaluate sleep-wake cycle shifts in adolescence in terms of the biopsychosocial framework. All you've got to do, if you're ever asked a question like that, and that would be a big question, I'd say that would be about maybe at least 4 to 5 marks. So all you have to do then is you already know the biological factors. You know about melatonin in sleep-wake cycle shifts, so that's all your biological factors. You just have to talk about the psychological and social factors too. So remember, the biopsychosocial framework is just about talking about biological, psychological and social factors. So if you can apply all of those concepts to a topic like this, then you would be able to get full marks for that question. And the reason why I even bring this up in this lecture It's just that a lot of the time in textbooks don't explain this topic in terms of the biopsychosocial framework. And so VCEE might put this as a question to kind of scare you off. There's always a question that students look at it and they're like, how do I approach that? So it's always good to kind of cover all bases and just make sure that we're familiar with that. What is that noise? Where is it coming from? Okay, I have no idea. But yeah, that's basically your psychological and social factors. So remember, psychological factors are anything relating to like thought processes. So, teenagers overthink, teenagers have a lot of stress, all that stuff. Social factors are like teenagers are on social media all night, teenagers want to game all night, etc. Okay, then we look at the use of placebo treatments. So with placebo treatments, it's not a really difficult topic to understand, but when students are trying to link this to mental health research, what's that noise? Let me just check. Sorry, is it coming from the mic? Let's mute that and see if that works. Okay, so I think it's still there. Okay, so the problem with placebo treatments is that a lot of the time, in order for mental health research to be successful, I actually don't know where that's coming from. Anyone know anything better than me to know where that's coming from?
It might be the position of standard.
Yes. Good observation. Maybe I'll stand on this side. Okay, so the main ethical issue with using... Yes, it worked, I think. Okay. The main ethical issue with using placebo treatments is that patients have to stop taking their active medication, yeah? And a lot of students, when they get this thing of use of placebo treatments, they don't know how to link it to ethical implications and then link that to mental health research. So what they do is they might just generally define placebo effect. They might try to make some link to mental health research and say this can harm participants, but they don't give that middle explanation. The explanation that should be in the middle of their response. So you need to be able to say that obviously use of placebo treatments is risky and it's dangerous in mental health research because a lot of the time when the participant stops taking their usual medication, when they stop taking their antidepressant to take a placebo, that causes them their symptoms to maybe reappear, that causes their symptoms to become worse or to actually exacerbate. So in that sense, in the absence of real medication, we are putting the safety and well-being of participants in danger, especially when they've got mental disorders where they can relapse into certain behaviours and their lives can be put at risk. So you really need to kind of underline that red bit, the purple bit and the red bit there, because those are the main kind of things that will make your answer really clear and structured and holistic when it comes to explaining placebo treatments. When we put this and informed consent into mental health research context, a lot of students just ignore the mental health research context and define what informed consent is in terms of research methods. But you don't get the full marks if you don't link it back to mental health research. Okay, so that makes up the bulk of your marks. Anyone knows what informed consent is about, but linking it to the mental health research part is where you are going to get the full marks for that. So it's always important to remember this topic and the informed consent in mental health research are both under the ethical implications umbrella, so you always have to kind of link them back to the ethical issues as well. Poor response to medication due to genetic factors. So this actually comes up in your factors that contribute to mental disorder. So usually if you're studying from the Jacaranda textbook written by Griffiths, this would be in about chapter 12. And so a lot of students there are quite familiar with how certain people don't respond to certain medications. So person A has depression, person B has depression. They take the same medicine, one person responds well, it works for them, the other person doesn't. But the way that they explain that isn't enough to get the full marks. So when I gave my students this SAC, we had a question on this, a lot of them wrote down that, people who have poor responses to medication are genetically predisposed to not absorb a certain ingredient in that medication. And that's why the medicine doesn't work for them. But it's important to remember it's not just about how you absorb that medication. It's not just about how you react to it. It's about these three things. It's about how you absorb the ingredients. It's about how you metabolize or break down those ingredients. And it's about how you eliminate substances within particular medications. Some medications that you might take, not exactly antidepressants, but other medications for schizophrenia, for example, they actually work as long as your body can eliminate the substance within that particular medication. So you have to remember it's not just about how we react to a medication, but all of those three things that actually affect how you respond. So you must make reference to the above underlined terms in blue. So if you're ever asked to define what is poor response to medication due to genetic factors, you need to be able to make reference to those three blue concepts: absorb, metabolize, and eliminate. The next thing that we look at is also another psychological risk factor for mental disorders. It's rumination. So rumination, it's actually quite a simple concept, but the reason I bring it up here is that a lot of students kind of fall into this trap of thinking that rumination is overthinking. In a very basic sense, rumination is overthinking, but defining it like that, especially for VCE psychology, is not enough. So, because everyone overthinks, you don't have to have a mental disorder or be at risk of a mental disorder to overthink. So overthinking is a normal thing people do when they're worried. Rumination is very different from that. Rumination is characteristic of an actual mental disorder. So rumination isn't just overthinking, it's dwelling on negative thoughts. It's repeatedly dwelling on those undesirable negative thoughts without acting to change them. Okay? And so usually with this topic, textbooks don't make this link very well, but usually with this topic, I always tell my students it's important to be able to link rumination to poor self-efficacy. People who ruminate dwell on negative thoughts and they don't act to change them. So if you've got high rumination, you've got poor self-efficacy as well. Okay? Does anyone know what self-efficacy is about? I think it's the next topic.
Your belief in something to achieve a goal.
Yes, your belief in something to achieve a goal, yeah? So obviously, if we are trying to achieve the goal of getting over this negative thought, and you've got poor self-efficacy, you're not going to believe that you can get over that negative thought, or get over the problem underlying that negative thought. So usually, if you're ever asked to talk about the relationship between rumination and poor self-efficacy, you should be able to make those links. So just pulling out key terms from the definitions and just linking them together. Okay? So that's basically what rumination is about, and it's important to never define rumination as overthinking because it's much, much more than that. Okay, so coming back to poor self-efficacy, some students kind of confuse self-efficacy with self-esteem, and I think it's important to kind of emphasize that they're not the same thing. So with self-efficacy is more about like your self-belief in your ability to reach some goal or solve some problem. Self-esteem is more about, like, it's a universal term that we use to explain someone's self-worth or someone's perception of what they're worth. Self-esteem, for that reason, is not related to self-efficacy at all. So, for example, with me, I know that I have the ability to teach. I know that if this PowerPoint were to shut down, I know that I could still manage and still finish this lecture for you guys because I know that I can deal with that problem. I have a belief in myself that I can deal with that problem. I would have a low self-efficacy in running a marathon because I'm not really prepared to run a marathon. Okay, for you, you might have a high self-efficacy in problem solving in a certain subject, but a low self-efficacy in problem solving in another subject. So again, people with mental disorders tend to have low self-efficacy or poor self-efficacy because they don't believe in themselves to be able to solve the problems that are racking their brains all night and making them worried. Okay, they can solve it if they put their mind to it, but they don't. And the reason they don't is because they have poor self-efficacy. So remember, poor self-efficacy, it's just like a person and a goal, and there are lots of obstructions between that person and the goal because of their lack of self-belief in themselves. Okay? So that's basically what self-efficacy is about. So I think it's really, really important to remember that if you've got high self-efficacy, you've got low levels of rumination and vice versa. So just know the relationship between the two. The VCE assessor I think there was a multiple choice on this in last year's exam, and I remember one of the assessors that we went to a seminar, and they were saying that a lot of students still don't understand this concept of self-efficacy. So it could be something they do examine, because they do look at previous year's performance and use that to guide the exam writing for the next year. So yeah, just make sure you are familiar with self-efficacy. The next thing is a really simple concept, and you're probably thinking, why have I put that up there? It's not a difficult concept, but it's the key term around this concept that I want to really clarify. A lot of students, when they think of this term or when they learn this topic, they learn it as loss of a significant relationship. But in an exam situation, they can't remember the key term, so they're just like, okay, let me just write loss of a loved one. It's not the same thing. If you write loss of a loved one in the exam, you won't get marks for that. Even though it kind of means the same thing, it's not the key terminology. Okay? So VCE have been really strict with this thing called scientific literacy. Scientific literacy doesn't mean you need to know the name of like every single neurotransmitter or neurohormone on the planet, but it just means that when there is a term that is kind of distinct to VCE psychology, you should be using it. And so, if you get a case study or a scenario-based question, like Katie has just experienced the death of her music teacher who had known her from the age of 4, taught her how to play all these instruments, blah, blah, blah. And it says, part A of that question is identify the social risk factor that increases the risk of mental disorder for her. And you write loss of a loved one, how many marks do you think you're going to get for that if it's out of 1 mark? No, yeah, you're going to get 0. So it has to be really exact, it has to be to the point. So loss of a significant relationship, because loss of a loved one usually alludes to someone blood related to you, someone that's grown up with you, like a sibling, a parent, a child, or a spouse. The loss of a significant relationship suggests that it could just be a teacher who helped you for a few years but left a significant mark on your life. It could be a community worker, it could be your soccer coach who trained you. So it could be anyone. So significant relationship is much different from a loved one. Okay, so just make sure that you use that term. GABA dysfunction is situated within chapter 13 in most of your books where we talk about specific phobia. So GABA dysfunction is one of those risk factors that increase the risk of someone getting specific phobia. Is GABA an excitatory or inhibitory neurotransmitter? Inhibitory. What does inhibitory mean? Stop. Yeah, it stops neural activity. So obviously think about your neural connections. Obviously think about your 2 neurons in your brain or in the brain of a specific phobia patient. They see a piece of thread on the floor, but they automatically think it's a spider. All these thoughts start exploding in their head, just like, okay, how far is the spider away from me? How quick can it walk? Can I escape the building? Is it going to kill me? Blah, blah, blah. Like they start to go into this overthinking, this spiral of overthinking. As they go into that spiral of overthinking, what's happening between the 2 neurons in their brain? Or not 2, the network of neurons in their brain. Is that overexcitation of neural activity or underexcitation? Over, yeah? Obviously there's overexcitation. In a normal person, what happens when we start overthinking in a normal sense or when there's excess neural activity is GABA comes in and GABA's like, okay, whoa, way too much neural activity here. I'm going to come in, and then it obviously gets released into the synaptic gap, and all the neural activity kind of normalizes. There's not as much neural activity happening anymore. What happens in a person with specific phobia is all that neural activity is happening, overthinking about the phobic stimulus, whatever, and then what happens is GABA comes in, but GABA cannot function the way it normally should. And so GABA can't come in to put a stop to that excessive neural activity. And that's why the specific phobia patient keeps overthinking, keeps hyperventilating, keeps catastrophizing, because that neural activity doesn't have a stop being put to it, because the GABA doesn't function the way that it should. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that's basically talking about the inhibitory action of GABA. So whenever you talk about GABA and glutamate, either in this topic or in minute 3 when you do lock and key processes, always use the word counteracts, neural firing. All of those are key terms that are really good to use for this topic. Again, coming under that scientific literacy, neural firing, counteracts, and yeah, just making sure that you understand how these things work. The 4P model, so the 4P model basically is quite straightforward, I think, but when it comes to identifying those factors in case studies or scenario-based questions, students tend to confuse them a bit. Predisposing factors are basically, a lot of the time we think of predisposing factors as being like genetics. More often than not in a scenario-based question, unless Vika wants to make it extra complicated, of course, but most of the time predisposing factors will be about genetics. So Karen's grandfather has specific phobia, or Tina's mother has depression. It'll be something about like genetics there. However, if there is no talk about genetics and it just says something like Tim has an imbalance of GABA in his brain, or Tina has an imbalance of serotonin in her brain causing her to have depressive thoughts, that imbalance of neurotransmitters, or in other words what we call as neurochemistry, also falls under your predisposing factors. Okay? Because me having an imbalance of GABA in my brain, or a dysfunction of GABA in my brain, or an imbalance of serotonin, predisposes me or increases my susceptibility to developing that disease or that mental disorder compared to someone who doesn't have that imbalance. Okay, so it's not just genetics, it can also be imbalance of neurochemistry, imbalance of hormones and stuff as well. So that's basically predisposing factors. Precipitating factors, so whenever you get, for example, a case study or scenario, and you're trying to identify what is the precipitating factor, look for the factor that initially makes the person develop a phobic response, okay? So phobic response or the fear response. So if it's like, trying to think of different names. Katie has a phobia, specific phobia of dogs. When she was 12 years old, she was chased by a pit bull and bitten and had to stay in hospital. So think about the initial event that prompted her to develop that fear response. For specific phobias, you always have some kind of initial event, situation, or factor that caused that particular phobia to form. So try to identify that, and that will usually be your precipitating factor. Perpetuating factors usually are basically those factors that maintain a condition. So if you're scared of birds, you never go to the beach because you know there's going to be a lot of seagulls running around, so you avoid going to the beach altogether. So basically, when we're talking about perpetuating factors, you always have to make reference to things like avoidance behavior, negative reinforcement, maintenance of the mental disorder. So if you get a case study and it's like, usually we link this topic to operant conditioning as well. So if you get a topic about, if you get a scenario about a girl who doesn't go to the beach because there's birds there and she's scared of birds, and it says, explain the role of operant conditioning in perpetuating Mia's phobia, Mia's specific phobia of birds, you would have to then say that Mia not going to the beach, obviously linking back to the scenario, Mia not going to the beach is an example of an avoidance behavior, which also acts as negative reinforcement. And then you define what that means. So then you say, obviously, every time she doesn't go to the beach, she feels a sense of relief that she's not seeing the birds, and that sense of relief reinforces her to no longer go to the beach in the future as well. Thus, in the long term, it's maintaining her phobia because it's preventing her recovery. She's not getting exposed to that phobic stimulus. Okay, so you always need to make sure that you do tie up those concepts together: avoidance behavior, negative reinforcement, and maintenance. And you have to make sure that you always make that specific to the scenario-based question. We're going to do a few scenario-based questions soon, so then you probably get what I mean. Protective factors are pretty straightforward. Basically, in a scenario, whatever part of the scenario kind of shows that the patient's getting some relief or some ease, that would most likely be a protective factor. So if it's like, blah, blah, this person had a really bad phobia of dogs, and it's like, but they have supportive parents or they have a supportive counsellor, then that's the thing that's going to be your protective factor. It's basically helping the patient to prevent that intensity of symptoms or prevent the reoccurrence of that condition or the relapse. Okay, so that's protective factors, the more positive element in any scenario. Then we look at the strengths and limitations of the trans-theoretical model of behaviour change. So a lot of you would obviously know what the trans-theoretical model of behaviour change is. You would know what are the different stages. And I think most people are fine with that. But when it comes to evaluating a topic means you have to identify strengths and weaknesses. So whenever you come across this term in a question, evaluate, it's about outlining strengths and weaknesses or strengths and limitations. Strengths and limitations? Yeah. So for this question, I would say know at least 2 strengths and 2 limitations. You don't need to know all 3, that's fine, but just know two of the strengths and 2 of the limitations. Just make it clear to yourself which ones you want to study. You don't need to study all 3, but whichever ones kind of stand out to you, whichever ones make sense. Generally, the ones that make sense to you will be the ones you remember. So try to go for the ones that are actually easy to understand or that you think make a lot of sense. And again, evaluate. You could be tested on this in multiple choice or in short answer. So you should be prepared to be able to do that. And with any topic in your book, I feel like the minute strengths and limitations come up on any topic, people just pass over it. They don't really study it well. And so in 2013, there was a question on evaluate the strengths and limitations of the transactional model of stress and coping, and a lot of people didn't know how to answer that because they only studied about primary appraisal, secondary appraisal, they studied examples of them, but they did not study the strengths and limitations of that theory or that model. And one of the key study skills is your ability to evaluate key psychological concepts, theories, and models, and that's actually in the study design. And that is one of the things that a lot of students can't do. So VCEE will definitely put it in somewhere, either a multiple choice or a short answer. So try to make sure you remember. And since this is a new topic that was not tested last year either, you might get asked something like this in the exam. So just try to make sure you're familiar with that. Okay, so how are we doing so far? We are okay for time. So are there any other topics from Unit 3 or Unit 4 you would like me to go through? I've got all my PowerPoints loaded up, so just let me know. And I'll give everyone like a 2-minute break just to like have a breather, and then we'll get back to it. So just let me know if there's any topics you want me to explain from Unit 3 or Unit 4.
We had a stat on this just like the other day.
Okay.
Where was it? It was just about REM and non-REM sleep.
Yep.
And in the textbook, it says that you always have about 20 to 25 REM sleep, even in late adulthood. And
Yes, do you have the Jacaranda textbook?
Yeah.
Yeah, my kids had the same issue, but we ended up giving them the marks because it was in the textbook.
Damn it, because I did because she got the marks for 2025 and I said 15. Or
Yeah.
below 15.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was just like, because our tests are
Yeah.
written from the textbook.
Yeah, that's true. No,
Yeah.
but technically I wouldn't, I mean like, I know it's in the textbook.
Unless it's a multiple choice question that's specifically asking like that, then you would probably say 15%.
Yeah.
Would you say?
I don't know why the textbooks say it's, I don't know whether the textbooks specify the age, what they mean by later
They
adulthood.
don't specify.
They don't specify, I remember that chapter, it's very vague.
And then the age in our questions were like 70, but then
Yeah.
the questions are like, the age is like 65 or 60.
yeah.
I suppose it's like, if it was a short answer, it would safe to say, oops, the person it's safe to say that like the REM sleep slowly decreases as you get older.
Yeah, that's
like-
correct. That's
yeah.
definitely correct. But I don't know, especially if it's a 20 to 25% REM for old age, that's not right because like that's suggesting that the REM is not decreasing as you get older. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it wouldn't make sense.
Because it is 20 to 25 here and then it's
Yeah.
20 here.
Yeah, which makes
Yeah.
sense because the other text stuff got
Yeah.
say this one.
Well, honestly, like if the other text, usually if it's an issue about the textbook, VCEE won't be that strict. I know it's like even in when we did it in class, we had to really look back at what did the high scoring students do, and majority of everyone basically followed the textbooks. So, but when it comes to this, VCEE they do account for the fact that different schools use different textbooks and there are different things. So with statistics, they're not as strict.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you were to get a multiple choice on that, it would be you wouldn't be like double guessing. It would be like there'd be a clear answer.
Maybe a question.
Yeah, and it'd be the closest.
So it'd either be like 20.
Yeah, because I don't feel like it's
20,
right for
15, 20. Like,
Yeah, exactly. So it'd be really like clear which one it was because it can't be that that's 20 and then it's 20 there and it's like 20 there as well. That doesn't make sense.
So would you say that it's probably like scientifically more accurate that it's around?
I feel that that's
And if sleep overall is decreasing, like to have the majority, like 50% of 7 hours in REM is a lot more.
I'd say
than
maybe
having-
later adulthood, like when you're like maybe in your 40s, you could have 20% REM possibly because you're still an adult.
this is
But the
like
book
quite
doesn't
old.
make the ages
Old
clear
age.
either. Later adulthood to old age is more like 50s, 60s, 70s.
And especially when they're getting
like-
more sleep, so they'll be getting
Yeah.
more sleep anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd say stick with something around that figure. If the case study or the scenario-based question gives you a specific age, like Tina is 75 years old, then you would know it's more towards the lower number.
Yeah, or you
but
could
if
just
it's like-
mention both and say
Yeah.
like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So again, it depends on what age the person is.
What if they were like 55?
55, I'd say probably that's still on the younger side
yeah,
a
like
bit.
adult.
Because I do health and human as well, and they do have a specific age bracket.
Yeah.
So I suppose if you've got that, like,
Yeah.
because then I suppose that's also another subject, but
Yeah.
it's still the same ages and
Yeah.
the same names. So yeah.
Yeah, I think
So
if
what
it's like
ages is
towards the
that? You know, like
later elderly, then you can say less than 15 or 15. But if it's like still in the early adulthood, like 50s, I'd say probably 15 to 20 is a safer range.
Yeah.
Again, these are not too strict with the numbers because different texts use different numbers.
Okay.
Yep.
So much.
No worries, all good.
I just don't
Okay.
remember.
Does anyone have any other topics they want me to cover from Unit 3 or 4?
It's not really like a topic.
Yeah.
It's more like, you know those 10 mark questions at the back of the exam? So
Yeah, yeah.
Like, is there, will you be going through?
There's not a specific structure, but I can give you some tips as to... Yeah.
They link a lot of concepts then.
Yeah, they do. They usually tend to link a lot of concepts, usually within the same area of study, but not always. Last year was within the same area of study, just talking about like sleep deprivation and stuff, but not always. Yeah. I'll mention a bit of that later. Yeah, no worries. In fact, what I'll do is I'll open up the VCEE exam so I can show you what that's like. So that's going to be... That's the one, so I'll go through that a bit later. Okay, so in that case, we'll just start looking at a few practice questions and then do some exam tips. So I want everyone to try to have a go at answering this multiple choice. So Anna and Greta both received an 8 out of 95. Anna was excited because this meant she could get into her first preference. Greta was upset because her score was below her first preference course. Which of the following best describes the respective autonomic response for Anna and Greta? So just try to see what answer it could be. Yeah. Anyone have any idea? B? Okay, let's have a look. Yeah, it's B. Good. So obviously, it's important. We can really use a process of elimination and just eliminate what's definitely not correct. Obviously, it can't be D because Greta is quite upset, meaning that it can't be eustress because eustress is associated with positive psychological response. Both girls are not experiencing distress because we see that Anna's quite happy. Anna will experience autonomic arousal and Greta will not. That's wrong because obviously eustress, if you have eustress or you're experiencing eustress, you still have increased heart rate, you still have increased cortisol and adrenaline, so that's still a stress response, you still have autonomic arousal. So the only option could be B, that both girls will experience a stress response even though they are different, and that both of those stress responses will involve autonomic arousal. Okay? So it's always important that whenever you get multiple choice questions, if the multiple choice question contains a term like never or will always, whenever you see an absolute term in a multiple choice question, it's usually not going to be correct. Because we can't have absolute answers for multiple choice questions most of the time. So if it's like, Tina will never experience eustress, that's probably not the answer because it's using an absolute term. Okay, so with this question, Ernst has recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and is showing signs of anterograde amnesia. Provide a neural explanation for the onset of Alzheimer's disease. So, how would you go about answering a question like this? Does anyone have any idea how we might start a question like this?
Like start with like introducing or like using the person.
Yeah, we can use the person's name. Yeah, that's a good way to go about it. What else? Yeah.
We could discuss like the neuro. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm really wrong. The neurofibrillary.
Yeah, that's where you get 1 mark from.
Or amyloid plaque.
Yes, excellent, good work. Okay, in Alzheimer's disease, amyloid plaque, that's an important thing you need to talk about, and the neurofibrillary whatever tangles. Okay, and you need to talk about those two, and then you need to link them to the fact that they cause the memory loss and cognitive decline that usually leads to anterograde amnesia and other memory-related symptoms. Okay, so amyloid is just a toxic substance. It gets released into the brain, and as it gets released, it kind of like kills off any kind of neural connections or brain cells that are there. And it basically leads to the death of neurons. Neurofibrillary tangles are kind of what their name suggests. When you've got neural connections, I can't draw neurons, so I will not draw one. Okay, so if that's neuron A and neuron B and they're connected, and you've got C and D. This is a very simplified diagram, by the way. So obviously, if these two are having a connection, then the connection between C and D, that neural connection gets tangled up in that, and then that gets tangled up in that. And so all the messages that are trying to get sent from one neuron to another experience this interference or this kind of disturbance. And so that's what we call as a neurofibrillary tangle, and it leads to cognitive decline because the messages that were supposed to be sent from one neuron to another experience this disturbance, which leads to people forgetting where they kept their hat, forgetting that they have an appointment, etc. Okay, so that's basically what Alzheimer's disease is about. This is not a properly studied area of memory because a lot of people just learn that Alzheimer's disease leads to memory loss, but they're not able to explain the biological processes behind it. So again, you do need to be able to talk about those, and this is a topic that was not assessed in short answer questions last year, so it could be one that they want to revisit for next year. I'm sorry, for this year. Okay, question 27. So just have a go, see if you can think of what the answer could be for this one. So the question is, which of the following best distinguishes short-term memory and working memory? So anyone have a possible answer? Doesn't matter if it's wrong, I know it's still early in exam revision. B?
D.
D? Let's have a look. Oops. Yes, good work. So it's D. Now the reason it's D is obviously by process of elimination. It can't be the others. It can't be A because working memory is not a synonym for short-term memory. This was an issue a lot of people in the past years were having when we used to have the two topics and people used to think that short-term memory and working memory were the same thing, but they're not. Working memory is kind of like a mental workbench. It's where you're actively working on something. Short-term memory, if you're working on a maths problem and you've got to remember one number to use later in this thing, you might store that in your short-term memory and continue working on the maths problem within your working memory. Okay? So basically, working memory is like a mental workbench where you're manipulating information that you are working on at the moment. STM is the entry point for information. We know that's not correct. Because that's obviously sensory memory, not short-term. Short-term memory has more limited capacity and shorter duration than does working memory. That can't be correct either because obviously we know the capacity of working memory is relatively unlimited. And D is the best answer there. Okay? So just be careful not to think of STM and working memory as being synonyms because they're not. Okay, this is a question on Loftus's work. So it's obviously a scenario-based question. I know it's a bit small. Desina was accused of stealing money from the school cafe during lunchtime whilst the manager was briefly distracted. Karen, who was in the cafe at the time of the theft, was initially asked by the teacher on duty for details of what she saw. She was then asked again the next day by the deputy principal to give an account of the theft. There were inconsistencies between Karen's initial account to the on-duty teacher and the subsequent account she gave to the deputy principal. So then you have to talk about, in terms of Loftus's work regarding eyewitness testimony, explain how Karen's account of the theft may have changed. And it's worth 3 marks. So usually where you're going to get those 3 marks from is you are going to be talking about, you are going to be first talking about Loftus's study. So making a small reference to what Loftus's study was about, just like a 1-sentence thing. And then after that you are going to be bringing in the characters of that scenario. It's really important to make sure you do talk about the names of the people in the study. So you do mention Karen, you do talk about the event of the stealing money, you do talk about the deputy principal questioning her. It's important that you do bring those elements into your answer. Because if you don't, then VCEE assesses what they do is they say this person has not related back to the scenario, they've not related back to the stimulus information. So you do need to kind of use information from the scenario and then form your response based on that. So obviously the 2 main factors that influence reconstruction of memory, as Loftus has showed us, is that obviously memory of the event can change based on what other people are saying. So other teachers, other students might have been gossiping about how Desina was stealing money, and that could have changed the way that Karen initially remembered what happened. Or the deputy principal or the on-duty teacher or someone might have asked Karen a leading question, and that could have set her up to respond in a particular way that was either biased towards Desina or biased towards the school. So again, those, you need to be looking at that and linking that back. It's a really simple concept, but just making sure you link back to the scenario is where the majority of your marks will come from. You can see that we've also used a lot of key terms in here. So we've talked about leading question, We've talked about the reconstruction of memory. We've talked about eyewitnesses. We've talked about the actual memory of the event compared to the initial memory. So all of those things basically show that you've got a really good handle on what the topic is about. And basically you're able to justify that according to the scenario. Okay, so there's no specific number of points you need to discuss for this question. It didn't say identify 2 factors. I just talked about 2 because the question is worth 3 marks. Generally, if the question is worth 4 marks, I just divide it by 2 and I talk about 2 points. Just to make sure that I'm not at any risk of losing marks because I haven't talked about enough stuff. Okay, if it's worth 6 marks and it just says explain the effects of partial sleep deprivation, I might talk about 3 in detail. Okay, so basically it's just like whatever the mark is, I usually just divide it by 2. If they haven't given you a specific number to remember, which they often don't. So in this question you can see explain how per account. It doesn't tell you how many factors you need to talk about, it just says explain. So it's always important to make sure you know how much you need to talk about. With the next one, changes in a person's psychological state as they move into different states of consciousness. So this is again another scenario-based questions. We do have a lot of scenario-based questions, mainly because like in last year's assessors report, they mentioned that a lot of students are finding it hard to relate back to scenarios. They're not using stimulus information and they are giving general or vague definitions related to the question which can't get any marks. So it's important for you to be able to make sure you know how to link back to the scenario. And it's not a difficult skill to do, it's just important that you are consistent with that. So this question is, Tina was involved in a car accident after having a few drinks at a party. Her BAC level was well above the legal limit when the police breath tested her. And this one actually gives you a number of things to talk about. So in terms of 2 different perceptual distortions, explain why it would have been dangerous for Tina to drive while in this alcohol-induced ASC. So it's worth 4 marks, which is quite a big question. All you need to do now is you first need to know what perceptual distortions are. A lot of the time, because in the study design, perceptual distortions isn't its own topic. It actually comes under a bigger topic called perceptual and cognitive distortions. And so a lot of students, because this comes up as one factor even in textbooks as well, textbooks don't separate it out, a lot of students start to think that perceptual and cognitive distortions are the same thing, but they're not. Cognitive distortions are related to your cognitions, the way that your thoughts might become impaired when you're in an ASC. Perceptual, what does perceptual relate to? When I say perception, senses, yeah? So perceptual experiences or perceptual distortions, in other words, are sensory distortions. Sensory meaning anything related to how you see, hear, taste, touch, what else? What other senses? See, hear, taste, touch, yeah. So any of those would basically be an example of a perceptual distortion. So, for example, in this particular thing, we're only talking about sight, so what Tina is not able to see or less able to see, and what she's less able to hear. So let's just go through the question. So in her alcohol-induced state, Tina may have been less able to judge visual stimuli, in other words, like sights, like hazards on the road. She might have found it hard to judge the distance from her car to the other car. And this might have been dangerous because obviously if she can't see hazards, then she's likely to get into a car crash. Also, Tina's ability to process auditory stimuli like sounds might have been lowered, so this might have kind of explained why she didn't hear the other cars beeping at her or the police siren kind of signaling her to stop. So, again, all we're doing is we're taking that information that we know and we're just linking it back to the scenario, adding in a few elements of the scenario there just to make it more elaborate, and that's about it. So you get 1 mark for naming that light blue, 1 mark for explaining in relation to scenario, 1 mark for light blue, and 1 mark again for relating back to scenario. So that's 4 marks altogether. Okay, so as long as you know the way to structure it, it becomes a lot easier to answer it. Yeah.
So when you're like talking about those things, could you possibly say like in her alcohol state, a perceptual distortion, Tina may have lost and use perceptual distortion and a cognitive distortion, or is it better to not include them and just kind of define what they are? If you understand what I don't know if I was confusing what I said.
So you mean like rather than talking about it like this, you just explain what the 2 perceptual distortions are?
No, kind of go perceptual distortion. Tina may have been less able to
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be the same thing. Yeah.
Okay.
But as long as you're not doing 1 perceptual and then 1 cognitive.
Yeah.
Because the question only asks for perceptual. If the question said in terms of 2 different perceptual and cognitive distortions, then you could do 1 cognitive, 1 perceptual.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. A lot of the time students learn it as one topic, so often when they're in autopilot mode when they're doing an exam, they try to bring in a cognitive one too, because that's what they used to do. Okay, so just always read the question, see what it's asking you, look at the mark allocation, look at how many things you have to talk about, just to make sure you're not wasting time, and also to make sure you're on the right track. Okay, okay, here's another multiple choice, so just read through that and just see what the answer could be, or what the best answer could be for that question. So it says, within a sleep lab, how could video monitoring be a useful indicator of NREM sleep compared to REM sleep? So video monitoring is again not a topic that was assessed last year, so could be assessed this year. Anyone have any ideas as to what a possible answer could be?
Would be A.
A? Maybe. Let's have a look. Good. A. Okay, so 22 is A. The answer for A is video monitoring could indicate that people are in NREM sleep when they have some movement and indicate REM sleep when they have little to no movement, which is correct. The others kind of indicate that REM has more movement, which we know is wrong, because REM sleep is also known as paradoxical sleep. Again, that's a good key term for you to know. Paradoxical sleep, which means that it's a paradox. So on the inside, there's a lot of internal activity. The body is active. We see beta-like sawtooth waves, which are associated with activity. But from the outside, the person looks as dead as a log, like they're not moving. There's not a lot of muscle tone. They experience something called muscle atonia. So that's a really good key term to use. In case you're not already using it. Muscle atonia is just a fancy way of saying loss of muscle tone. It's one of those scientific literacy things that VCE wants you guys to start using. Okay, so basically, the A is the best answer for this one. We've got another two here. So these ones are a bit smaller, so see if you can answer these as well, just to see, give you an idea of how much you remember. So the first one is, which of the following tasks would be most difficult to sustain after 24 hours of sleep deprivation?
D, yeah. Because aren't simple tasks more harder than complex tasks?
Yes, exactly, yeah. Simple tasks tend to be harder to do than complex tasks, because when we're doing a complex task after sleep deprivation, we know it's hard, so it's like a psychological thing where we do try to put more focus and attention into it. When it's an easy task, you're like, yeah, that's easy, why do I need a thing? Or, you know, even when you pulled an all-nighter, you're like, let me just go to the lecture. It's not like I have to do any extra hard work, I just need to sit there and listen. So that's why it's D, because D is a very easy task compared to the other two there. Obviously, can't be sleep, so it has to be the other two. And the other two are more complex tasks, so generally easier tasks are the ones we get wrong after sleep. Okay, after we are sleep deprived. What about 27? Anyone have any idea?
B, because you need more deeper stages of NREM to restore and replenish.
Okay, yeah, good. And what is the name of the theory associated with
I think it's restorative.
restoration? Yeah.
Restoration.
Yeah. Good, awesome. You guys are really smart. Okay, so restoration theory. Another thing I have to mention here in relation to our scientific literacy. In previous study designs, or if you've bought notes of someone who's done psychology prior to last year, the actual rule before last year was never use the word restoration theory, because the theory is to be called the restorative theory, not the restoration theory. So if you're going across past VCEE questions that are before 2017, and there's a multiple choice question like explain what is meant by the restorative theory, don't panic. This is the term you are using, okay? You are using the term restoration, not restorative. I know this because a lot of the time when students go through past VCEE exams during these holidays, they see different terminology and they're like, wait a second, we use this one now. This is the one we're using, okay? The restoration theory of sleep. And obviously the other one used to be called survival theory, but now it's called the evolutionary or the circadian theory. So just being wary of those different changes in terminology. So obviously, yes, that's correct. So we know that when you're running a marathon, he's not running a marathon and doing a Sudoku puzzle at the same time. It's only running, so it's only majorly physical strain that's happening there. If it's physical strain, then it's associated with NREM, because NREM is linked to that physical restoration of bodily cells, replenishing muscle cells, repairing any broken tissues, etc. Okay, so the later stages of NREM specifically deal with that physical restoration. restoration. Okay? And we see that as people get older, generally the time they spend in the later stages of NREM decreases as well. Okay, so that's good. The next question is about the sleep-wake cycle shift. So Lisa is a 15-year-old student. Her father constantly scolds her for waking up late for school. He tells her if she just went to bed early, she'd be able to get up early in the morning. Explain possible reasons for Lisa's situation with reference to 2 ways in which this adolescent sleep-wake cycle differs to that of an adult. So in this question, if we're following the rules of making sure we address the stimulus information, what are we going to be putting in this question? First thing.
Lisa.
Lisa, yeah. Lisa's name. Her father's obviously not named here, so we don't need to name him. But Lisa's name has to be in there. Think about it this way. If you had a question written about you for a VCE psychology exam, it's quite a coveted thing. So you would want someone who's answering that question to mention your name, to acknowledge you as a person, okay? Lisa is a person, so just use her name in the scenario, simple as that. Since Lisa is an adolescent, her waking up late for school due to the sleep-wake cycle shift, that's when I mentioned the topic, okay? That topic is not mentioned here, it's not mentioned anywhere in the question. So you need to make sure you make it clear that you know that this question is going to be about sleep-wake cycle shift. So, sleep-wake cycle shift and delayed sleep onset. Then you explain what it means. This means that due to changes in the release of melatonin and growth hormone after puberty, she falls asleep 1 to 2 hours later than in childhood. So going to bed early might be futile, might be useless. Also, Lisa requires more sleep than her father because she needs around 9 to 10 hours sleep, whereas adults generally need around 6 to 8 hours. So those are the 2 ways, first talking about the amount of sleep needed, and then talking about the hormones. Those are the 2 ways in which the adolescent sleep-wake cycle differs from that of the normal adult. Okay, so you need to just make that really clear, using those key terms, delayed sleep onset, melatonin, sleep-wake cycle shift, all that stuff. Using Lisa's name in the situation, again, like I said, is really important. You don't have to go into depth about melatonin here. Yeah?
It says again, whereas adults, you wouldn't need to put father there, would you?
It'd be better to put father there. Yeah. So it's good you picked up on that. You can put her father needs 6 to 8 hours, but because we already mentioned father at the beginning of that sentence there, it should be fine. And from the case study, we know that her father would be an adult if she's a 15-year-old girl. So it's kind of like implied, but it would be better for you to write father. And if her father was named in the case study, it would be even better. It was like, her father Tim, then you could just write Tim. Yeah? But if it's not, then it's good. Whatever stimulus information you can use, the more you can use, the better. Some people go as far as to quoting information from the case study. That's actually the best thing you can do. Quoting information and backing it up with your explanation. But this is not a really long case study, so there's not much we can quote there. This is a topic that was covered in last year's exam, so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of depth. But again, I did tell my students last year as well, it might be on the exam, so know it well. So this was one of the questions where they didn't split up too much. Name and describe a learning process. So little Albert is now 17 years old. He comes to you for therapy regarding his problem with white rats. So again, they don't make it specific that he's got a phobia in the question. Name and describe a learning process you could use to help Albert overcome his fears. So this is a question about those evidence-based interventions, okay? It's just another way for VCE to make the word treatment a lot more complicated. Evidence-based intervention is another way of saying treatment. So if you ever see that word mentioned in a question, outline an evidence-based intervention for a specific phobia, it just means outline a treatment, okay? Evidence-based intervention is just a treatment. A treatment that has been backed up by evidence. Okay, so obviously the only answer we can put here is systematic desensitization for this particular question. So systematic desensitization, and then what would Albert be exposed to? So Albert would be exposed to approximations of the conditioned phobic stimulus. What that means is rather than shoving a white rat in his face, we give him like little glimpses of a white rat. So rather than giving him the actual white rat, we show him a picture of a white rat. Then we show him a documentary about rats. Then we show him a little plush toy of a white rat. So basically what you're doing is little by little, you are kind of like easing him into getting used to white rats rather than him avoiding that. Okay, and at each step of the way, our little Albert's going to be taught relaxation techniques. So if he starts to if he starts to hyperventilate when he sees the little toy white rat, you would probably tell him, okay, breathe, relax your muscles, don't stress. So he'll be taught those relaxation techniques, which will help him to cope at every step of the way. Have you guys seen what a hierarchy of tasks looks like for systematic desensitization? Yeah. So basically it's just like, you know, from 0 to 100, the person rates their fear level for each task, and with the hierarchy of tasks, they're different for each person. So this hierarchy of tasks can't be used for every single person who's got a phobia of white lights, for example. Okay, so basically those are the key terms you need to mention when you talk about systematic desensitization. One thing a lot of people forget is the relaxation techniques, that at each step of the way, they've got relaxation techniques that they can use. Okay? And again, we have mentioned Albert's name in this scenario, so obviously we are using all those key terms like CS, conditioned fear response, and all that stuff that basically is required. Yeah?
So like it's fine to just say like systematic desensitization in the semicolon, like you don't have to go like the name.
Yeah, because the question is name and describe the learning process. Okay. So in this case, you can just go systematic desensitization, put your colon, and then just talk about it. Yeah, so you get 1 mark for naming, and the remainder of the 2 marks would be for the explanation. Yeah. Also, I'm pretty sure everyone knows this, but your neutral stimulus in any situation when you apply it to a phobic context is your phobic stimulus. Okay, so usually if it's a question about phobias, rather than just say neutral stimulus, you would say the phobic stimulus. Yep.
Do you think it's like a waste of time in an exam to like go into like the effort or say the learning process you could use to help Albert overcome this fear?
Yes.
Systematic.
It is a waste of time. It's what we call as a padding sentence. So generally it pads up your answer and fills up space, but it's like it's not worth any marks.
So just go straight.
You can just go straight into saying systematic desensitization. Yeah. Or you could even say Albert could use systematic desensitization and underline it. You don't need to say, you know, like in primary when it's like, oh, repeat the full sentence, repeat the question you asked. You don't need to do that. Just go straight into talking about what you need to do. Because every word takes up time. Okay, this is quite a straightforward question, just making sure you guys know that there are characteristic changes that occur during memory formation. It's worth 2 marks, so we'll just put the question up there. So during memory formation, you've got new neural connections that are established between neurons, which obviously lead to a memory being strengthened. You've also got existing neural connections that become strengthened. So that's a really straightforward answer. There's also an alternative thing that you can write there, is that you can talk about the growth of the dendrites. We have something called dendritic spines, which actually happen when a person is learning information or committing information to memory. It's when the dendrites in neurons involved in communication become greater in number, and they actually become bushier or hairier in nature. So they look bushier if you put them under an analysis. So basically, that's something you can talk about as well for that thing. So just make sure that you are using those key terms like strengthened, neural connections. If you want to make reference to pre- and post-synaptic neurons in this answer, you can do that as well. But because it's only worth 2 marks, so 1 for each, you don't have to go into that much depth. This is a question that was covered in VCE 2011. Last year they didn't give a lot of emphasis to biopsychosocial framework in the exam. So this could be a question they might ask, or anything related to the biopsychosocial. So the biopsychosocial framework explained how these biopsychosocial frameworks have changed the way health professionals consider health and well-being. So a lot of the time with biopsychosocial framework, we memorize the definition, we come up with examples of biological, psychological and social factors, but we don't know the purpose of the topic. We don't know the purpose of why do we have that, how does that help health professionals. So there are some key terms mentioned in this question. So whenever you're talking about the biopsychosocial framework or you're evaluating it as a model, you need to be able to say that it has a strength or advantage in that it is a holistic view on mental disorders and mental health. A lot of the time it explains how different factors, so biological, psychological and social, can interact to basically form a person's well-being. Whether that be mental or physical or social well-being, it's showing you that just because a person has depression, it doesn't just mean that they're depressed. It doesn't just mean that only psychological factors are affecting them. It could mean that there are biological factors at play, that there are psychological factors at play. And for that reason, it kind of promotes physical, mental and social health as all being interrelated and equally important. So those are the kind of key ideas you need to be talking about if you're ever asked to evaluate the biopsychosocial framework. And you can see the average mark for this was 0.8 out of 2, which means a lot of students might have left this blank or just tried to answer it maybe half the answer, but they didn't get the full marks for it. So again, this question is an example of how just knowing the definition is often not enough. It's important to understand the purpose behind each concept and topic as well. Okay? And holistic is obviously a key term that you can use when you discuss the biopsychosocial program. Okay, we're nearly done. We are on good time, that's good. Okay, so Stella is 17 years old and she's undertaking her VCE. So obviously Stella's feeling overwhelmed by what Year 12 involves and has had difficulty sleeping during the school term. Her friend Audrey, however, is enjoying Year 12 and is finding the SACs challenging but manageable. In terms of primary appraisal of Lazarus and Bregman's coping model, explain why Stella and Audrey have evaluated their situations differently. So in this question, the first mistake you would not make is talking about secondary appraisal, because obviously the question only asks you to talk about primary appraisal. A lot of students, what they do is they see Lazarus and Feynman's transaction model of stress and coping, and they don't even read the whole question, and they just go straight into talking about primary, and then they talk about secondary, then they go back and look at the question and it's like, oh, well, I just wasted my time writing about secondary appraisal when the question didn't even require it. So just make sure you always read the question. Just because VCEE are really bad and give really bad questions, sometimes it doesn't mean that they'll ask you to talk about a really big topic in one single question, okay? They might only be asking you to focus on one concept. So, Stella feeling overwhelmed by Year 12 might indicate that her primary appraisal is stressful, as she has having difficulty sleeping. So I've taken that straight from the case study, where is it there? Taken it straight from there, just put it there, whoop, and that's it. She might also have further appraisals of threat, example, failing the stack, which would affect her final score. Now, whenever you're comparing two people or two concepts, it's always good to use connecting words. Connecting words like in contrast, in comparison, so in contrast. It just makes your answer flow, makes it sound more logical. Comparison. Similarly, if you're talking about two similar concepts, etc. Okay? So in this case, we're using in contrast. So in contrast, Audrey might make a primary appraisal of Year 12 as being a challenge. While it is stressful, it presents an opportunity to test how hard she can work and what she can achieve. So the state average for this mark was 1.7 out of 4. And this is one of those topics that students do find difficult to link up, because usually a lot of students don't understand this topic well in the first place. And then when they're asked to relate it back to a scenario, it becomes even more difficult. So you get 2 marks for relating primary appraisal to Stella, 2 marks for Audrey. So an alternative response we can use for Audrey is that Audrey might not really care about how she performs in Year 12, and so the stressor might be seen as irrelevant for her. So she doesn't go to the next stage of further appraisals. Like I said, you don't need to talk about secondary appraisal here. So I think last time we did go through this kind of flowchart where we did talk about, oops, let's see if I can find it, where we looked at this flowchart that helps us to understand, there we go, okay. So this flowchart generally helps you to understand, or kind of look at it as a step-by-step concept. So basically, in primary appraisal, we ask ourselves, is the stressor irrelevant, is it benign, positive, or is it stressful? And if it's stressful, you go to the next level. So if it's stressful, then you can make further appraisals. So in that case, we were saying that Stella, obviously, since she made the primary appraisal of stressful about Year 12, then there was another threat. There was another appraisal she could make, which was threat. What harm could happen? So maybe her study score could get affected, maybe her SAC average could go down. So that's basically what we're talking about, okay? So just, if you're familiar with this kind of flow chart, you should be able to complete any question on scenarios when it comes to the model. Yeah. Okay, is that kind of clear so far? Yes.
Yeah, say if like they don't give an example of the threat or the harm or whatever, are you able to make one that is suited to the scenario?
Yeah, I just made one up. So it obviously didn't say that she failed the SAC, but I'm saying it could affect her final score. So that's fine.
Would it be best to say like a possibility or like it could, like, you know?
Yeah. You can say that. You can say that she could have further appraisals of threat. Example, because she's so stressed, she could fail the SAC in the future. It could potentially happen. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. You don't always have to only take it from the scenario. You can use the scenario to, justify it. Okay, this is a research methods question, but before I go to this, I might just give you guys some tips on, okay, so this was that 10-mark question from last year. You will get a 10-mark question this year as well. I won't go through the assessor's report, that's something you can download at home and go through, but I will tell you some stuff they told us when we went to this whole seminar thing about last year's exam. Basically, you will get a 10-mark extended response question. A lot of people are like, oh my god, it's like an essay, but it's not an essay. You can use subheadings, so I'll just write things down. You can use subheadings. So with this question, we'll just read through it quickly. So Tim is a healthy 32-year-old male who's been working the night shift as an aircraft engineer for 12 months. Typical night, so he's got typical night shifts at the company, 4 nights on, 4 nights off. Each shift is 11 hours in duration, beginning at 7 p.m. and finishing at 6 a.m. So obviously, when he'd normally be asleep, now he's at work. Typical of shift workers. So once a year, the company runs an information session for all employees regarding the effects that shift work can have. Tim's new colleague, Alira, was unable to attend the information session. Alright, so now he's been asked to make a series of notes for the session. So basically, what you need to include in the notes is mentioned in that case study itself. So it says the information provided at this session included the potential changes to regular sleep-wake cycle, potential consequences or effects on physiological and psychological functioning, as well as protective factors and intervention. So automatically, if I was doing this question, I would have highlighted those things and I would have made them kind of subheadings in my answer. Because that's what you need to talk about, right? It says considering the above information, so obviously considering what has been written up there above, you're going to create a detailed and clearly organised set of notes. So to make it less overwhelming on myself, I look at what information the question gives me and I make subheadings based on that. So it's very clear to me now what I need to include. So obviously I've got to include 1, 2 consequences, 3 protective factor and 1 intervention. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So I've got to include 4 main ideas and it's worth 10 marks. So each one is approximately 2.5 to 3 marks worth. Okay, so obviously when you write this down as subheadings, it makes it look like you're doing like 4 little questions rather than 1 big 10-mark question. So it makes it a bit easier on yourself. So you can use subheadings, and considering this, did they just say create a set of notes? What did they write? Create a detailed and clearly organised set of notes. This is VCEA's way of saying, don't give me a bunch of crap on this paper that I can't even read, where I have to start from here and go to the back of the booklet. Make it nice and organised, okay? Use subheadings, use little boxes if you want, do anything you want, use diagrams, that's fine, but just make sure it's clearly detailed and organised, okay? If you have your paper like this, it doesn't mean you've got to write lines and lines of text. You might decide to, what's that thing? Physiological, psychological functioning. You might decide to have a subheading like effects on sleep deprivation. Sorry, effects of sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation. And then you might decide to have 2 boxes. And one could be physiological, one could be psychological. Make it look nice. Make it look like it's something that people who come to a seminar would want to read. Okay, so obviously it's going to be something that's going to be provided at a session. It's going to be something that other people are reading. So make it look nice. You can use diagrams, you can use little text boxes, you can use subheadings, you can use big headings that come above the subheadings, it's fine. Just make sure that it's clear and clearly organised and detailed. So obviously it doesn't mean you're a psychological symptom and then just put 1 little point there, 1 word. You do have to kind of go into a bit of detail. Yeah?
Because it was based on sleep and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is it gonna be? It wouldn't be that again, would it? Or possibly?
The possibility of that being that again would be quite low.
Yeah. They
generally don't tend to repeat it if they've already assessed it previously. Yeah. So I mean, if we look at the topics in Unit 3 and 4, I would say it would either be about stress, because stress is something that comes up in Unit 3 and then again in Unit 4. Or it could even be about mental health. So you might be asked to maybe talk about the 4P model in relation to someone. You might be asked to create a mental health pamphlet. It's not always going to be about a pamphlet, but I'm just giving you some ideas. Okay, either way, whatever question you get, don't stress too much about this. They will give you some kind of clue as to what you need to talk about. So in this question itself, you can see, a lot of people, what they do is they skip all of this, they read this question, they're like, what do I talk about? I don't know what to talk about. And then they basically panic, and they don't write much. So just make sure you're reading through the whole case study information, because a lot of the clues as to what you need to talk about are in the question itself. Okay? Highlight and underline it and then make subheadings out of it. Yep?
Jenny, you have to write in full sentences when you're at documents.
You can write dot points, but then the problem with dot points is they don't really have a hard and fast rule with writing in dot points, but what the chief assessor was saying is that a lot of the time when people write in dot points, it causes them to write less. So they mentioned that no one has everyone that got 10 out of 10 on last year's exam actually wrote in full sentences. Yeah, so that's like, I'm not saying you're going to fail if you write in dot points, but like generally when you write in dot points, you kind of constrict yourself to writing less. Yeah.
What about for like, what you've done, like the effects of sleep deprivation?
Oh, that's fine. You can write in dot points and then you might just explain it a bit. So all I'm saying is you don't want to write a one-word response, like headaches. Explain what kind of headaches you might get, or you know, that kind of stuff. Okay, so basically that is what we mean when we talk about this question. So whatever question you get, you don't need to panic. I feel like there's a lot of panic and hysteria around this question. It's fine. It's just like you'll get a question, you'll have some clue as to what you need to talk about, and then you just go about it the way you do. The only way you can prepare for this question is just to make sure you've got a strong foundation with all the topics in the study design. And just, if you can, make links between topics. So for example, so stress comes in Unit 3, and stress comes again in Unit 4. How does stress come in Unit 3? How does stress come in Unit 4? So just try to make links between topics wherever possible. That's not only going to help you for questions like the 10-mark question, but it's also going to help you for like other questions. Okay? Because it's very possible, that you could get a question that starts off talking about stress in terms of Unit 3 transactional model, and then goes into another bit where it starts talking about a person who has a specific phobia, and then you have to talk about the role of the stress response in phobia. So there could be a kind of like interrelatedness of topics. Okay? And that's what VCEE are trying to do. You'll notice if you look through last year's exam, generally they do try to link topics together. Okay? And so I will close that for now. Whoops. Yeah. Okay, with this research methods question, it's pretty straightforward. I think we did a research methods question last time as well. I'm not going to go through this in depth, but I've given you basically all the answers. If you go through this, when you go through this at home, if it doesn't make any sense, just email me and I'll explain it a bit more. But that's basically your scenario, and you're basically being asked to state your population, state the sample procedure. You had a very similar question to this in last year's exam. So that's why I put this one in, just so you have an idea. We talked about operationalizing variables last time as well. Operationalizing a variable just means talking about a variable in terms of how you are measuring that variable. So if my IV here is sleep deprivation, well, how long am I being sleep deprived, okay? Because I could be sleep deprived for 5 hours or 15 hours, and both of them could be classified as sleep deprivation. So specifically, how are you measuring that specific variable is how you operationalize it. Again, whenever you're talking about operational terms, it's all about operationalizing the variable. So I'll let you go through this at home. In fact, if you can kind of hide the answers on your paper and actually do this question yourself and then kind of double check the answers, that would be a good way to practice research methods as well. How are you all going with research methods, by the way, so far? Okay? Good? That's good. That's good to know. Generally, you won't get a big question like this worth 10 marks anymore, but this is just showing you how we identify variables. Yeah?
Just with operationalizing, I've come across questions where it's like, how would you operationalize this? Do you just say the independent variable operationalized, like just with the random?
Well, usually you get the information to help you operationalize a variable in the scenario itself. So, for example, here, let me just go back. So this is about a PhD student. Obviously, she wants to investigate the effects of sleep deprivation on cognitive functioning. Usually, when it tells you what they want to investigate, you've got your IV and DV in that sentence itself. So obviously, the IV is going to be sleep deprivation, and the DV is going to be cognitive functioning. That's pretty clear. Then you read further into the case study to get an idea of what sleep deprivation is going to look like in this study. Okay? Because in this study, sleep deprivation is staying up until at least 2 a.m. and rising before 7 a.m. If I conduct another study, I might say, okay, I don't want to torture my participants too much. I might make them stay up until at least 12 a.m. and then waking up at 5 a.m. or something. Okay, so basically the way that these numbers all happen, the way that we are expressing that variable in our study is how we operationalize it. Yep. So anyway, you've got all the answers there, so just feel free to go through that in your own time. You can see I put an answer and then an explanation for why it's the answer there. But if that still doesn't make sense, please feel free to just email me. I'm happy to explain that a bit more. Now, okay, so obviously I do have to kind of mention this, but these are not going to be on the exam for sure. They're just predictions, okay, based on what was covered in the 2017 exam. We're just looking at what could be covered on this year's exam. Generally, VCEE has, well, they haven't said this, but usually they don't repeat topics again. You don't see that happening. So these are related to the short answer section. Multiple choice, they generally tend to assess a bit of everything. The short answer section, these things were not assessed last year, they could be assessed this year. Okay? So again, you can just look at those, maybe give those a little bit more focus, especially if you are struggling with certain things relating to that. So obviously predictions for Unit 4, these are the predictions that could be in the exam. Again, not for sure that they'll be in the exam, but just looking at, it's always good to see what wasn't tested last year. So these were the things that were not assessed last year, and you can see we did go through quite a few of them in the lecture itself. Now remember, I'm not a fortune teller, I'm not like some inside person from VCEE, so don't send me an abusive email after the exam. No, that was covered and blah blah blah, because yeah, it's just a guide, it's just some suggestions. Okay, so tips for the exam. So obviously, we want to do the exam in the best way possible. I do believe that there is a thing like exam technique where it can prepare you well. So there is a good way that you can study for the exam. So before we go into my stupid little tips and things, this is some assessor advice from the 2017 exam. So this is straight from the assessor's mouth, basically straight from these things when we've met the chief assessors and all that stuff, what they've said. So students should write within the marked boundaries for each question. So basically, when you get your exam paper, unless they've changed it, but usually this is what it looks like, it'll be, you'll have these two areas blacked out and it will say do not write on this page. So obviously, naturally, you would not write on this page. But people still have written on that page last year. So on this side where it says do not write, some students have actually tried to write in that section. And what that has caused is that that's actually caused students to lose marks. Even if you get very close to that question, your answer could get cut off, because what they do is they scan your papers. They don't just mark it physically, they scan your papers onto a computer and then mark it. So if you're writing very close to the edge here, your answer could get cut off and you could lose marks for that because your answer is not complete or they can't see your whole answer. So please make sure you do write your answers within the boundaries of that page. Secondly, if you do continue an answer, don't just expect the VCEE assessor to go to the back of the booklet and look at your extra space. Make sure you indicate it. So if you're on question 2CI and you're like, oh crap, ran out of space, just write back of book, and then just go to the back of the book, write 2CI and continue from there. Okay? You really need to make that clear, because a lot of the time what happens is students end a sentence there, and then it looks like their answer is complete. And VCEE says, okay, that's 1 out of 3, it's not a complete answer, and they don't always look at the last page if you haven't indicated it. Okay? Remember, VCEE only scan what is necessary as well. So sometimes, if you haven't written anything at the back of the page, or if it's blank, they might not scan it. So you just need to make sure that you are being specific. Like I said before, avoid padding information in your responses. Like, you don't need to write the name of the system, the name of the process used to eradicate phobias is systematic. You can just write the name straight away. Directly answer the question and don't add padding information there that's not necessary. If you're being asked to discuss the lock and key process, if you're being asked to identify the 4P factor model or identify the precipitating factor in a scenario, you don't have to first define precipitating factor and then identify the actual factor from the scenario. You can just identify it straight away. Again, your ability to decide how much information you need to add in a response is going to be based on how many marks the question is worth, as well as how much space they've given you as well. Okay, so just make sure you kind of use that to gauge how much you've got to write. Obviously, making reference to the scenario, using names, using situations, events, anything that's mentioned there. Generic responses cannot achieve full marks, so that's something they've said time and time again. If you just generally define a concept but don't link it to the actual topic, you will not get a full mark. So with that question with Lisa and her father, or Destina and Karen and the theft of the money from the canteen or whatever, if you don't mention those names or you don't make reference to the situation and you just talk about Loftus's testimony studies, or you just talk about sleep-wake cycle shift in general, you're not going to get marks for that. So you need to make sure you do link it back to stimulus information. Spelling errors, you're not going to lose marks for spelling, but you will lose marks for not spelling these scientific terms correctly. So if you don't spell glutamate correctly, you might lose marks for that. If you don't spell, if you're talking about, for example, psychotropic medications, if you don't spell that correctly, you lose marks for that. So again, if it's just a normal term that doesn't come under your psychological scientific terms, that's fine. But if it's one of those terms, then you do need to make sure you spell it correctly. Also, one more thing, I don't think many of you make this mistake, but I'll mention it anyway. When you say convenient sampling, it's not convenient, it's convenience. Okay? So never write convenient sampling, it's convenience with an ENC at the end. Last year, students were making this mistake, so that's why I'm saying it again. Convenient sampling from an English point of view, convenient is an adjective, so it makes sense, but no, it's convenience, okay? Because your sampling is through convenience, because obviously it's the people most accessible to you. So just don't use that word. VCE has said if you mention the word convenient sampling rather than convenience, you get 0 marks, even if they know that what you were saying was the correct thing. You've spelled it wrong. Don't repeat keywords in your response. If you have to define or distinguish between inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitters, and to give an example, don't say an inhibitory neurotransmitter is one that inhibits neural activity. Unpack the term. You can say it prevents neural activity. It puts a stop to neural activity. But don't say it inhibits neural activity, because that is showing the assessor that you don't really know. What inhibits means, and you can't unpack the term. And when you're distinguishing, I already talked about this, when you're distinguishing between 2 or more concepts, we want to try to use those connecting words. So in contrast, in comparison, in addition, similarly, conversely, depending on what you're talking about. Okay, it just makes your answer flow better and look better, and obviously, even though answering structure and grammar and all that stuff isn't really heavily focused on in psychology, if someone writes me a beautiful response with all these nice connecting words and it just flows, I am going to be inclined to give them a good mark if they've got all the other content in there as well. Okay, so just make sure that you are giving those kinds of flowing, kind of coherent, logical responses. Okay, so these are a few of, these are like not really VCEE assessor tips, but these are just like my general tips. Now, obviously we know each VCE psych trial exam is 2 hours 30 minutes, which is a long time. So if you can't do a lot of trial exams for psychology in full-time conditions, at least try to do practice questions, okay? I remember when I was doing psych, we didn't have a lot of exams. We were also the first year of the study design at that point. But we had a lot of practice questions that our teacher got from here and there. So what I would do is I would just do it under time conditions. For you guys, time conditions means 1.25 minutes per mark. I know that's being super, super exact, but just use it as a guide. So basically, if you had a 2-mark question, you might spend about 2.5 minutes on it. Now, with timing, you don't have to be super strict. People think, oh, it's 50 multiple choice questions, which will take 50 minutes. Usually it doesn't. If you've practiced enough questions and you've done enough study, you would be able to finish multiple choice questions in about 30 minutes or 40 minutes. It might not take you exactly 50 minutes, okay? Because each multiple choice might not necessarily take you 1 whole minute to complete. Sometimes it's really easy, you're like, oh, I definitely know that's the answer. Should be option A, option B. Might take you 20 to 30 seconds as well. Okay? And I'll give you a tip for also maximizing your time in multiple choice as well soon. Have an errors book. So if you're making the same kind of errors on the same kinds of questions, try to have a little notebook or some sticky notes where you can write down what are the types of questions you continuously get wrong and do those questions. Usually I have students that are like, Miss, how many practice exams should I do? 40, 50? I'm like, are you crazy? We don't even have that many exams. And number 2, doing that many exams, I just feel like is efficient if you're learning from your mistakes. If you're just spamming exams for the purpose of spamming and bragging about it, then it's probably not going to be useful. So try to just do practice questions, do practice exams, look at where you're making mistakes, and then do more. If you're unsure about content, look for alternative ways of understanding. YouTube has so many good videos. Wikipedia pages. Simply Psychology is a really good website that explains a lot of our VCE psych topics as well in simple terms, so that's good. A lot of this stuff I've already talked about. So obviously look at the mark allocation and the answering space before answering a question so you don't go off track. Don't overcomplicate things. If you know that there's an answer, like if you know an effect of partial sleep deprivation that is clearly the answer, but you're like, wait a second, I want to impress my assessor, I want to write a more complicated one. Just stick with the easier one. You're not going to get extra marks for writing a complex example that no one else used. It's just better to go with what you know. You can also plan answering questions rather than doing them. So if you come to a point where you're really like burnt out and a few days before the exam you just want to kind of revise topics, you don't want to do full questions anymore, that's fine. You can actually just look at a big question like a 10-mark question or a 5-mark question and just plan. How would you answer that in an exam situation? What would you write first? What would be some ideas you'd mention? So that's actually really good because it gives you that mental idea of how you might answer a question like that. Try not to leave any question completely blank. Write something, you might get marks for it. Even if you're just jotting down a few key terms 1 minute before exam time is over, it's fine, just write something there, don't leave it completely blank. Not only because you risk losing marks, when an assessor sees a blank question, it just looks like you haven't even bothered, and it really gives a bad impression of you as well. So just look like you've tried, and they might give you something out of sympathy at least. At least I would if I were to, yeah. Use reading time to get in the zone, breathe and drink some water, okay? So obviously close to the end of reading time, I was actually marked exams last year and I'll be marking them this year too. And I remember when we were going for marking last year, one of the chief assessors was saying that there was this thing that happened a few years back where a student left one of the multiple choice bubbles unshaded, and then for the next question they shaded it in the previous question's bubble. And every single multiple choice after that was wrong. And obviously because a computer marks it, then obviously she like contested this with VCEE, but they were like, they couldn't give her the marks anyway. Because the multiple choice is marked through a computer, it's scanned through a computer, your computer doesn't account for human error or for mistakes or misalignment issues like that. So if you don't know the answer to a multiple choice question, just circle whatever the best answer is. Don't leave it blank because you risk making that mistake. On the note of multiple choice, close to the end of reading time, maybe in the last 1 to 2 minutes of reading time, just try to rehearse the first 3 or 4 multiple choice responses in your head, like A, B, C, D or whatever, or A, C, D, B, whatever, okay? And then as soon as the examiner says start writing, you can quickly shade those bubbles into your paper. Yeah.
So you recommend doing multiple choice than the short answer?
Well, that's the way I did it. I'm not sure how it works for everyone else, but I think multiple choice is one thing you can get out of the way within 30 to 40 minutes. It's good to, there's nothing worse than kind of finishing short answer and then realizing, oh, I've got to go back to multiple choice. So I feel like this is something easy, you can get it out of the way as soon as possible. Yeah. Yep.
When I've done exams with multiple choice, often I spend like the whole 15 minutes rehearsing the multiple choice, a little bit more. Is it better to like make sure you at least look at the paper and
at least look at the short answers, yeah. Honestly, 15 minutes of reading time is a lot of time, especially in the VCE exam. I don't know, it feels like it's longer for some reason. Just go through the whole exam, take note of any short answer questions where you look at it and you're like, crap, how am I going to answer that? Okay, question 3, I've got to come back to question 3. So you know you can allocate extra time to that. And then maybe, if you've got a really good short-term memory, you can probably try to hold it in the first 6 or 7 multiple choice in your head. But this is a little way of getting a good head start. And it gives you a bit of that confidence boost, like, hey, I'm on top of things. Even though probably 5 minutes later you'll be like, no, I'm not, but yeah. In reading time, if you come across, I just mentioned this, so obviously in reading time, if you come across a short answer question, try to allocate extra time to it if you can. And obviously try to quickly finish the easier essay questions first so you can spend more time on that one. If you're running out of time, don't stress. So if you've still got a few questions, like I said before, just jot down some key ideas you're going to mention. Don't leave them completely blank because your assessor can give you points based on those. I already talked about this whole fiasco with the multiple choice thing, so you know what to do there. In short answer questions during writing time, if you're talking about key terms, highlight or underline them. You're not going to lose marks for not highlighting or underlining, but when you're going through your paper at the end, it's easier for you to be like, oh yeah, let me give you true, exercise true, I've done it, that's it, and then move on. Not only that, but it also makes it easier for your assessor to follow your paper and mark everything. And as you're working through questions, just keep looking back at the question, don't completely ignore it. Keep looking back to make sure you've covered everything, that you're not going off track or that you haven't confused yourself. Don't stress too much. A bit of eustress is okay. Obviously, we need eustress to get us motivated to do things. Make sure you proofread your exam. For me, I was writing until the last 10 seconds. I was writing. So at least flip through your exam and just look at the fact that, have I missed any questions? Have I missed a page? Have I not written something somewhere? Just make sure you do that at least, and make sure every bubble on your multiple choice is shaded. And at the end of the exam, try not to get caught up in discussing answers. From personal experience, it just made me feel like crap. It made me doubt my own answers, made me think I was going to get an E+. I don't know why I said E+, an E. But basically, I ended up doing a lot better than I expected, and I just stressed myself out for no reason, and just, yeah, it wasn't good. So, your friends are not VCE double assessors. Your friends probably don't have insider information as to how this all works, so don't really get bothered if your friend has written something, you've written something different. Just wait till VCE give you your results, and you'll be fine, okay? And that's about it. So all of us for the exam. Before you leave, if you can just write down your email address here so I can email you all my Unit 4 PowerPoints. And so I'll have your email on file so I can email you if I've got anything extra to give you, like HAL exams or anything. Okay? So that's about it. So everything will be on the recording. We've got spare